pew, 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 pew. So you want to make projectiles, huh? Huh? Where am I? It's 90 plus degrees. Sorry, but this is all you're gonna get. I'm naked. So the concept for today's video actually came from one of you guys, and the tutorial in question was to create a system for projectiles. Now, I wasn't 100% certain on what you meant by this, and by the way it sounds, it seemed like what you were interested in was a action battle system. And to create an action battle system through events or in the background with common events, well, that would be somewhat ludicrous. You'd pretty much need a plugin in order to recreate a whole combat system, because you'll have to consider things such as different ammo types, different effects that it may cause, the ticking away of enemy HP or the player's HP. So there's a lot that would go into that system. Therefore, we're not going to be creating that at all. However, if that is what you are looking for, then I would highly suggest you search up Action Battle System for the RPG Maker system that you are using. If you are using MZ, there is one person that I found on the internet. However, they do ask that you contact them if your game has any commercial plans. Instead, what I'm going to show you is how to fire a bullet from the player, hit a wall or an event, and return with a result, such as the enemy dying. Or maybe you need a special bullet to fire into a special event to unlock some mechanisms. So I'm going to go up here to create my projectile. And the projectile that I'm going to create is a flame, because we don't exactly have a bullet from the RTP system. And I'll go ahead and call it Projectile 1, in case there will be more in the future. And of course, we'll want to create our event. And let's bring stuff back in here, because after all, zombies are pretty weak to fire, supposedly. And now we're going to do the rest in our common events. So I'm just going to change the maximum. Alright, so for this, we need a couple of things. We need the player to fire out the fire. We need to track the fire as it moves. And we need to check whether or not something happens when the fire reaches its destination or collides with anyone. So for this one, we'll call this Proj, and I'll call this Player Fires. And we will trigger this on parallel process. And the switch we're going to have to create. So I'm going to just create the switch up here, call it start, have it go on auto run, just to turn on a switch. And I will call this one Projectile. I forgot to finish it with an erase event. Now I'm going to go back to my common events so I could create this, but of course make sure that this is on Projectile. So we want the player to hit a button. So we're going to need a conditional branch. I'm going to go to page 4, go into button. Now using the OK to fire the projections may be a little bit awkward, because of course if you're in front of something that's interactable, then you'll also interact and fire the projectile, and that'll be awkward. So I would highly recommend that you do a bit more research. Try to find a plugin that allows you to use the full layout of your keyboard and change the hotkey to something more appropriate. So for now, I'm going to just have the OK button, and we want is triggered. Apply. And if the OK button is pressed, then we want to set event location, and we want the projectile one to go to certain variables, and those variables will be player X and player Y. Now these two are variables I created in the past, but please just make sure that you create your own as well. So player X and player Y. However, we will of course need to initialize it. So I'm gonna hit OK and apply, which means that just above it we're going to do page 1, control variables, and the player X that you created will be in game data, character, map X. Okay. And the same thing for the Y. The next important thing is to make sure that the projectile will go to the correct facing direction, because the way that we're going to run this fire being projected forward is through a set movement route, and the set movement route will just be to step forward, step forward, step forward, however many times you want. I'm gonna have it do a total of 4 times. I think that's a good distance. We do not want to wait for completion, and we're okay with this. So because this set movement route is on step forward, and this one says it's direction retained, this means that whatever this direction is, which is down, that means this projectile will always move down regardless of wherever the player is facing. So we just gotta fix that by creating more conditional branches above the set movement route. So if player is facing down, I'm going to do an else branch, apply. Then we just want the projectile, control copy, control paste, to make sure it is facing down. There it is. In this one, we do want to wait for completion. And now I'm going to just take all this, copy and paste it in here, and adjust it as so. And the last one has to be up, so I don't need a conditional branch for that. I'll apply. Okay, if you notice, there's no delay between the player pressing the OK trigger button, which means that the player will be able to fire like 1,000 fireballs, and it will just be, well, a terrible time. But I am going to do that later, because we also have to understand if the fireball was to hit a wall or hit the event before the end of these 4 steps, which is why I do not have the wait for completion checked off. So we're going to put a hold on that delay. We're just going to move on. And for this one, I'll call Proj track. For this one, we want this on auto run, and we want this on projectile. Very much like how we track the player up here, we're going to be tracking the fireball. Paste. And we're going to have to create some variables, so I'm going to go ahead and just put it in here. I'll call it projectile X and then projectile Y. Edit that, go for Y. Go for Y of projectile 1. Apply. And now for this one, we're going to check whether or not the fireball has either hit the event or has hit a wall or some other obstacle. Now, how can we determine whether or not the fireball has reached an obstacle? Well, that is with something we call regions. So if you go ahead, you'll see that we have an optimal amount of 255 regions that we can have in a single map. Now, if you are using plugins, there's a chance that your plugin is using regions for whatever other function. Well, don't worry, as long as you're not using conflicting regions, then you guys will be perfectly all set. So I'm gonna just pick one at random just to prove that you can do whichever you want. Yes, indeed. I actually like using triangles. I'm gonna erase that afterwards. Okay, I absolutely regioned up everything that the fireball can interact with that is not an event. And I'm gonna just leave it on this image so you can refer back to it so much more easily. And what I'm going to do here is do page 2, page 3, and we want get location info. And what we're going to do is or what this is going to do, is that it's going to take two variables, which are the x and y, aka their coordinates of the fireball as it's being tracked. We're going to get the region ID of wherever the fireball is located on, and it's going to store it into a variable 33 region ID, and I'll just say that this one is specifically for the projectiles, and I'm gonna hit OK. Apply. Now I'm going to do a conditional branch, and I'm gonna leave the else if branch being ticked off. And for here, I'm just going to do a very simple comparison to say that if region ID projectile is equal to my random number that I happen to have selected without looking, to be honest, then, well, the fireball will want to be extinguished. And you could do this in several different ways, you know? But the first thing you gotta do is make sure that the fireball stops moving. So we're just gonna have a set movement route, and we're just gonna have the projectile. We need to interrupt any previous movements, and to do that, I'm just going to say wait 20 frames. Okay, and if you want to have any sorts of animation, then you can. Like, what's a cool animation for fire? Could it potentially be fire? There we go. A little bit overwhelming, which you'll see in a second, but I think that's okay. I'll keep wait for completion on, and then we want to make sure that our little fireball turns completely invisible. So to do that, we just do transparent on. And then we send the fireball all the way back to where it came from. Event location, fireball 200. Go back there where no one can see you. No one will know that you exist. Only you and me. It's a secret. Okay, so now we got this going on. It is time that we head back into this one to think about delaying this to ensure that the fireball does not constantly spam itself. So to do that, I'm just going to create a switch and call it projectile fired. Fired. Okay. Now I'm going to go to track, and I'm going to change this to projectile fired. Apply. So now we need to go down into this conditional branch and just turn off projectile fired off. Because clearly it has reached an obstacle and has played its effect, and now it's done. So heading back into player fired, we can actually take all of this and do a conditional branch to check whether or not projectile fired is off. And then we take all of this, cut it, and paste. And yes, I do mean off, because if it's on, then that means the projectile has left the player and is currently being tracked. Now we also got to make an assumption on if the projectile did not hit an obstacle. So the way we do that is, well, we know how far the projectile will travel, 4 steps. And depending on the facing direction of the projectile, if it's down, left, right, or up, we'll know whether those 4 steps will alter the x, the y, in a positive or negative direction. Because after all, the top over here is 0, 0, and as it goes to the right, it increases in x, and as it goes down, it increases in y. So, once the projectile has been fired, then guess what? The use of tracking the player is no longer needed. So what I can actually do is take this, copy, paste it, open this up, add constant 4. So whatever the previous y was, say it's 15, now we say plus 4, which is 19. So if he was at, oh my god, did I actually guess it? No. So if the player was at 15, and let's assume that this continued on, then +4, 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll know when it would have stopped. So the same story would be true for everything else. Up is -4, and X and Y. Left is -4, and right would be +4. So now that we have it in here, we can go back to project track, and this time it will test whether or not the projectile has made it to its governed position. So in projectile tracking, all we need is 2 conditional branches, and it is now testing whether or not the projectile X is equivalent to the player X. And again for the Y's. So recall that player X and player Y has been adjusted. Currently it's the player's actual position, then based on the facing direction, it's calculating where the fireball is supposed to end up, and that's why it works here. So for this one, I think we could just ignore the flare and just go straight into making it invisible. So now that we have this, let's test it out. I'm pretty sure I made it faster, huh? And we got a bug, and I know exactly what that is. So first, let's make our fireball faster. Let's have it go to 5. 2 times faster. And let's go back in here. And the reason why it bugged out is because this is checking if the projectile is on the location. But because the projectile is not passed through, it will always stop in front of the object that it will collide with. So if it's an object, it will collide with that and it will stop right in front of it. If it's the wall, as you saw, it stopped right in front of the wall, and for that reason, it broke. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this and make sure that it's set to through. And I also want some stepping animation to make it look a little bit cooler for when it pauses for like that 20 frames. And fire! Oh, Jesus Christ. That actually gave me a little bit of the spoobies. Fire! Fire! I can't fire anymore. What's happening? Oh, I forgot to. So, right here, when we set him off, I forgot to make his, the fireball no longer transparent. That was obvious. Alright. So other things I want to do is, that thing was terrifying, but let's go back to Proj track. Let's change this from wait 20 frames to 4 frames. Make it happen a lot faster. And run. Pew! Oh, that's kind of funny. Okay, so if you notice, the fireball kind of lingers a little bit before it completely disappears, and that's because of how the animation works. In here, wherever fireball is, fire 1, that was the one that played. Yeah, so the best and only way that we can fix that is if we actually go back into here wherever all this animation was going on, and we'll change it to wait for completion unchecked, and we're just going to have it in here where it waits for about, found 70 to be somewhat appropriate for this. Of course it won't be perfect because it is animation based, and it kind of is how it is. Now let's shoot a blank. Haha, there we go. Blanks, blanks. It's kind of funny. Alright, so last thing we gotta do is see if it hits an event, and very similarly, it's basically just seeing if its X and Y has reached an event's X and Y. So the annoying part about this is that we do have to test the conditions for both the else branches of these two. And you can imagine how tedious That will be if you ever need to make changes, because it would mean making changes for both of these. And you can also tell how hard it is to find your code that you need. So what I'm going to suggest you guys do instead is use a bit of script calls. And what I'm going to do right now is just look at the variables ID, 19 for player X, 20 for player Y, and 34 for X and 35 for Y for the projectile. So now I'm going to just go into this one, open it up into scripts, and type exactly, including the case sensitivity, game variables dot value. Let me move my mouse out of the way so you guys can actually see. And I said 34 for the X. If it equals game variables dot value, it was 19 for the player's X. So this, all it does is where you see this, it will pull the value of the variable at ID 19, and likewise for 34. The double equal signs is testing whether or not it is in fact true or false. Now I'm going to do a double ampersand, and what that ampersand is saying is that if all of this here is true and everything to the right of it is true, which will be the Y, so 35 and 20. Oops, not 335. So now when you look at it, what it's saying is if this side is true and this side is true, then it will be true and play whatever's inside. So I can actually take all this, cut, paste it in here, and delete that. Now, if this side is true and then this side is false, then it's actually going to return false and go to the else branch, or just skip it entirely in this case. So that's how you read that. So I'm going to actually take this, do an else branch, control copy, and paste it in here. And the reason for that is because we're now going to test conditions with the events X and Y. So I can actually take all of this innards, delete it, because we want something similar to this here. Paste it in. And I'll open this up and make the changes. So we don't have any variables right now that represents the stuffs X and Y. So I'm going to go ahead and change that by doing control variable. And I'm going to take some of my old variables, which is killer X. You can of course create some right now. We're going to go into game data, character, stuff, map X. And likewise is true for the Y's. Projectile Y and stuffs Y. So now what we got are oopsies, not you. 43 and 44. Okay, so we're gonna open this up and we're gonna make those changes. So it's 43 and 44. Okay, and if it hits stuff, then explosion, apply. Oh yeah, and we can also get rid of the else branch. Okay, apply. Okay, SR. Die. Okay, last thing to do is if you want to have whatever events that takes place after your fireball or your projectile hits your event, or maybe a wall, then just put it in here. Likewise, if it's a wall, put it in here. If it's a dud, put it in here. And so on and so forth. So you can see, just by looking at this code, by looking at all of the events that it has to target in particular, and how many variables are being used just to track the projectile, the player, and the event or events within the game, you can imagine how much resources and how repetitive it is to create an entire battle system like this. Not to mention, it'll also depend on each map. So you'll have to create more for every single one of your maps that you'll have this in. And that is exactly why you want a plugin to do this instead of creating it through events. And there you guys have it, Projectiles with MZ. I would not recommend creating a whole entire system just for this, because you do have to track every single individual event. You do have to contract every single individual projectile that you make, and you do gotta track on every single map that you have it on. Pretty much this is more so for those who are trying to create a small puzzle with finite projectiles, finite events that's being interacted upon, and on like one or just a couple of maps. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do hit those like buttons, subscribe if you happen to be new, and if you are interested in seeing what I am creating, it is called Caster's Trap. You can learn more down in the descriptions or on my beautiful website that contains more of my tutorial videos. Now if you excuse me, me and this fan are gonna, well, family friendly. Later.